Oh my God, Becky. Hello and welcome. I'm Maria from Sew Through Time, and today we're starting a new series about historical silhouettes and how they were achieved through clothing. Today we're specifically talking about that ass and how to get that large derriere silhouette that was fashionable in many different points in history. We're not going to be focusing on other skirt supports. There were definitely other things like hoops and panniers and things like that that were designed to either support the skirt pretty evenly throughout and make the skirt big, or make your hips big, or some other thing, some other silhouette aspect. This is specifically about that big derriere. On this channel, we mostly talk about fashion history and the history of beauty and hair. So if that's something you're into, feel free to subscribe if you haven't already. Now let's get to those false rumps and bustles and all that makes that historical big butt silhouette. Let me start by explaining that throughout history, as long as women have used body garments to modify their silhouette and their body, it has never been considered something that is a negative thing. It has always been considered a part of their outside body, the body that they present to the world. Having your private body, the body underneath the clothing, and your public body, the body that is made with the clothing, as two separate things, started in the early modern period when things like buckram and fabric stiffenings were used first to modify the appearance of the body in the form of bodies. These bodies were later boned, but in the beginning they were just garments stiffened with lots of layers of fabric and stitching. And what that public body looked like was very much at the whimsy of fashion, and it was oftentimes extremely exaggerated. It was not supposed to, in any way, shape, or form, reflect the inner body, the private body. It was actually considered a status symbol to have that private body be a very different shape than your public body. And since this idea was already well established in the early modern period, by the time we get into the 18th century, it would have been the social norm. The first time in history that we really get only that big derriere silhouette, rather than having big hips or big wide skirts in general, is in the late 1770s, early 1780s. And that starts off with a pad or a rump that is shaped kind of like this. There are different variations to this, but this gives still a little bit of emphasis to the hips, but most of the emphasis, as you can see, is in the derriere area. This type of padding can be seen in the image, the bum shop, that is from the 1780s. That is a caricature of the era, but it does actually show a lot of real padding. You can tell that this type of padding was quite common because in portraiture, very oftentimes you can see that the skirt makes the silhouette that this type of padding would have made throughout the 1780s. So even if the trend does shift a little bit, this does stay fashionable and worn by the elite throughout the entire decade. Probably the most scandalous and most iconic silhouette of the 1780s is created by this false rump that has really two buns. And the idea is that especially the Italian gown with its long V shape, that the V comes in between the cushions so that it really creates that bun illusion when the gown is worn. And while something like these two would be more appropriate for somebody a little bit more elite, especially this one because of the scandalous nature of this, something like this, on the other hand, would have been worn pretty much by all the classes. This is an exact copy of a rump found in the Finnish National Museum, and though this exact version was worn by an elite woman based on the gown, because of the size and shape of this could be worn pretty much universally. The silhouette this one gives is just a little bit of oomph to your derriere and giving that little bit of lift that creates that proper silhouette, but it doesn't actually interfere with your skirts at all. You can hem your hem exactly as if you were not wearing any sort of skirt supports and still have them be even at the bottom with this one. And as we head into the late 1780s and early 1790s, the emphasis really goes on that rear instead of the sides. So the padding shape changes a little bit. This is actually not based on an exact copy, but rather based on the images that we see in portraiture. So this is something that creates that correct silhouette, so it's most likely that they wore something very similar to this. As far as materials go, these rumps were oftentimes made out of different sorts of weaves of linen fabric. So basically they were made out of the same kind of fabrics as your undergarments and table linens. And they were typically stuffed with either wool roving or horsehair for the more pad-like things. And for the false rumps and other bigger padding, oftentimes you could also use feathers. But if you do use feathers, I would highly recommend using a really densely woven fabric because, like you can see from this one, it sheds like crazy if it isn't super densely woven. And then as we head into the Regency era, you would think that padding went away completely, but actually tiny little pads can be still found in the rear of dresses, oftentimes kicking that dress out, especially if you naturally are a little bit straighter, so that you get that pretty silhouette with that derriere shape and with that silhouette going backwards instead of forwards. But that really depends on your body type. And like with a lot of these paddings, your body type is really the biggest determination what kind of padding you need. A lot of times throughout the Victorian era and the entirety of the 19th century, you do have these little pads or skirt supporters. And how big these are is really determined by your anatomy. These type of garments are oftentimes used at the small of your back to make your rear start a little bit sooner than it actually would. Or to balance out that silhouette when you have big poofy skirts, so that if you don't naturally kind of tilt backwards a little bit, that then the skirts will hang weirdly to the front. So then you would use a little pad to give that little bit of extra oomph. My pads for this are very thin because I come with quite a lot of padding on my own. But if you are less padded, then you could add a lot more padding to this, and then it could have little rolls on it, and it could be a little bit larger. So how much padding you would use personally is very much determined by getting that correct silhouette. Because in history, the important thing is that silhouette, not the size. So you would always want that silhouette to be balanced and proportionate to your body size. So whatever part is supposed to be the emphasis of the silhouette, that needs to be in proportion to the other parts of your body. So of course, if you are naturally very tall and very lean, you're going to still keep those curves a lot smaller and more proportionate to the rest of your body. And in the opposite end of the spectrum, if you are already very curvy, and especially if you're kind of short and curvy, you're not going to want to pad out a lot for a lot of silhouettes because you don't want it to become a caricature of the silhouette. You want it to stay natural looking. You want it to be balanced. So even if it's very artificial, it still needs to be balanced and in proportion to your body. And while those big butt silhouettes stay away for quite some time, they do come back with a vengeance in the very late 1860s and really take off from there. But this time, because they're growing from the hoop skirt, they actually have wires in them. And at first they're attached to that hoop skirt sometimes, but they do become their own separate garment quite fast. This one is a very large example, very typical of the very early 70s. This will very much kick back the back even further out than the actual derriere area, but already the derriere starts basically exactly from your waist. The silhouette is very squished and everything happens really fast. This type of boned garment allowed for a lot more exaggerated silhouette than would really be possible by a padded garment, because this would get really heavy and hot especially stuffed with wool, if it was this big. So the boning really allows for it to be breathable and a lot more comfortable when you get into really exaggerated, really high fashion, really silly silhouettes. But this also allowed it to be a lot more universally worn, because something like this that allows airflow and will keep you cooler is something that you can wear when you are working, unlike the very stuffed padded things that would be cumbersome and hot if you are working. Of course, something this large would not be worn by a working woman. Working class women would be wearing smaller bustles, but they did in fact wear bustles. But just like before, in the 1870s, there were many different types of silhouettes, and even though it was always emphasis on the butt, it wasn't always the exact same size and a shape. There were also much lighter bustles and bustles that would not use any sort of wires. This particular bustle is called travel bustle, and this is made out of really stiff fabric, and it lies flat like this for traveling and packing. Flat like this, it is too big to fit your back. But the idea is that you draw it with using the drawstring so that it is then bunched up in the back. So this creates already a lot of volume. And then you would separate these pieces so that you create that big bustled effect. And this actually gives very similar silhouette to a lot of the other more structured bustles. But this is a very light garment. This is easy to wear, and this is easy to carry with you, and especially if you are traveling by train or by carriage, so that you need to be sitting for long periods of time, and you don't necessarily want to have a big layer of hoops behind you, or even though it does go flat when you sit, it does still take up room. So something like this would be a lot more comfortable in a long carriage ride, which is bumpy and going to be uncomfortable anyways, because this will crush with you so that you don't have any hard bits behind you. So you can sit a lot more comfortably. You can lean back without having any sort of wires behind you. And then once you get up, all you need to do is fluff out the skirts, and this will fluff back up, and it will still create that big fashionable silhouette. And this is also really good for sports and things like that, where you don't want any sort of heavy wires involved. In this era, also padding was used, sometimes with a big bustle or sometimes as its separate garment. Especially if you don't naturally have much of a derriere, sometimes you'd need a little bit of extra oomph, or if the bustle silhouette starts a little lower and the fashion is now for a higher bustle, instead of actually buying a brand new bustle, you could just add a little bit of padding to it and help create and change that silhouette a little bit so that you have a more fashionable garment. And again, when we get into the natural form era, I don't personally use a bustle or any sort of padding in the natural form era, simply because I'm built that way. But if you are not built that way, they definitely did use padding. There were many options for padding, and even though we tend to think of the natural form era as a bustle-free era, they did actually have wired bustles as well throughout the natural form era. Sometimes they were mostly to kick back that very lower part of the skirts and create that like long lean effect, but they would also create that butt effect, because a lot of the natural form era does actually have quite a bit of butt to it. And one bustle that I do have to specifically mention, even though I don't personally own it, is the lobster tail bustle. It is named that because it very much looks like a lobster tail. And this was a common bustle for both in the 70s and in the 80s, both in the natural form era and both of the bustle eras. And then as we get into the 1880s and the second bustle era, the bustle comes back with a vengeance. This time it is even more bigger and more dramatic, but the silhouette is very much only derriere. So whereas in the 1870s, you can definitely see it being wider and the skirts in general being slightly wider, though there isn't much emphasis on the hips, in the 1880s, you can see that the wires are very much only in the back, and they stay very narrow throughout. So no matter how low the wires come, the bustle silhouette stays very much only in the back, whereas in the 70s, the wires tend to widen towards the bottom. And of course, there are a lot of variations to this. This is by no means the only bustle type that they had. They had so many different types, and they could even use different combinations of different things. And as you might be able to tell from these images, there are actually other elements that go into the entire silhouette, but we're not going to be talking about that this time. That is one for another video when we get to the other parts that form the silhouette. And then as we head towards the 1890s, the silhouette changes again and the bustle gets smaller and smaller, and eventually it becomes a small skirt improver. And this padding is used very much to just fill out that small of your back. So the silhouette is supposed to be a well-rounded silhouette, a well-rounded butt that starts all the way from your waist. So even if you do have a larger butt naturally, you're still probably going to need some padding because most of our butts don't actually start from our waist, but there is first our hip area where there is the small of the back that tends to be slightly sloped before your butt starts. But they could also use much larger padding depending again on your natural shape. Eventually though, as we get into the next century, this pad is oftentimes a part of the skirt rather than its own separate garment. It can be still its own separate garment, and you can find this as late as the early 19-teens. Then this really goes away from fashion and doesn't really ever make a reappearance, because then we already head into the eras where the silhouette is considered more a thing that your body is supposed to do rather than a thing that you create with garments. Don't get me wrong, there has always been pressure for women to look a certain way and be a certain size to some extent, and to have like a more fashionable body. But a lot of that pressure was alleviated by the use of these undergarments because it was expected. Nobody expected the body to be exactly the way it was fashionable. As we get into the 20th century, that becomes more and more prevalent, especially as we get into the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, where it really is not anymore about the silhouette, and it is really about fashionable body parts. And the idea is that you need to actually change your body to be the shape that you want your garments to be, rather than your garments determining the shape and then you just making that shape with the garments. This is also the time when shapewear garments start to be considered something that is slightly embarrassing, something that you are correcting something that is wrong with your body, rather than just a necessary part of getting dressed. And while in the 1980s and 1990s, there definitely were sold undergarments that would give you a false rump, they were considered something that is slightly embarrassing, that you're covering up a defect in your natural body rather than you building up a public body. There was that huge shift in how we view bodies, and especially how we view the difference of the body that is on the inside versus the outside. And while the past definitely had a lot of problems and a lot of ways of oppressing women, I think that this is something that we kind of lost, and something that is actually more oppressive nowadays, when we actually think that we should change our bodies to do the fashionable silhouette, especially now that we have gone from the very voluminous, very junk in the trunk kind of silhouette back to, again, to the skinny silhouette, which, I mean, one body can't do both. One body can't do it all. So then they start marketing plastic surgery to us. They start marketing all kinds of junk, and they make us feel bad about our actual bodies. Whereas all this padding, all these garments that I have shown, they weren't really intended to make you feel bad about your body, and there wasn't really that stigma around them. Throughout the Victorian era, you can see different sorts of bustles and rumps very publicly advertised in magazines. These are not something that women kept as women's secrets. No, that men definitely would have seen the advertisements for the different kinds of skirt supports and things that women wore. And they also ridiculed women for them. So in that way, we weren't any better than we are now. But they still accepted it to a certain degree. It was considered the norm to change your body, with garments. And though some of these silhouettes are so extreme that with our modern day cars and houses that simply do not have the room to maneuver in some of these garments, they can't ever come back. But I still wish that this sort of silhouette building to a certain degree would come back, because I think that it's so much healthier for women's self-esteem to not have our public body and private body be the same thing. Well, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope you learned something new. If you did, please hit that like button because it really does help out in this universe. And me and Noodle will see you again next time. Bye. Yeah. Are you tired? We'll say bye to the internet people. Bye. Do you want to eat my fingers a little bit? Yeah. Boo boo booty boo. Yes. We'll say bye to the internet people. Bye to the internet.